See the people here. Lila says this here. Is Andre Vete coming? Is Andre Vete here?
Yeah, he's there.
Good evening. Distinguished Professor Dipankar Gupta of Shiv Nadar University, Dr. Kavita Sharma, Director, Justice Leela Seth, I think I saw somewhere, Dr. Andre Bete, Rajni Kumar, well, friends and admirers of Rosalind Wilson. A hearty welcome to the 2014 Rosalind Wilson Memorial Lecture. 2014. Rosalind departed from our midst on the 20th of July 1992 at the young age of 49 after a valiant battle with cancer. 22 years have passed, but to our friends, her memory is still fresh and green, especially of her warm, generous nature and her ever-present warm smile. Rosalind came to India in the 60s. At first, she was a teacher at St. Thomas's School and later taught at Springfields under the watchful eye of Rajni Kumar. Did a stint with the Press Institute of India and was the editor of the children's magazine called Target. Rosalind made India a home and was deeply immersed in our country's culture and values. The aim of these lectures is to organize a lecture in her memory on a topic which is dear to Rosalind. Rosalind was a multifaceted personality who had a variety of interests: children's education, environment, literature, equality, and some of the persons who delivered the lecture, Rosalind Wilson Memorial Lecture, was just as Ida said, Professor Andre Betaille. I don't know whether Keki Darola is there. He also gave a lecture on literature. Rosalind had an abiding sense of social justice. She was disgusted by the obscene display of wealth at weddings and other functions by plutocrats. The hideous inequalities in income and wealth were shocking to her, especially owing to her working class background and socialist leanings. I must tell you one thing. We had collected some collection, make anthology of various things. Justice Patnaik? Sorry, Justice Patnaik, I noticed you. Thank you very much for coming. Justice Patnaik, Supreme Court. There is one passage we are very fond of, and that was Dr. Ambedkar's speech in the Constituent Assembly. I think we have forgotten it. I think I need to remind all of you, I'll read it. He said, we must make our political democracy a social democracy as well. Political democracy cannot last unless it resides at the base of its social democracy. On the 26th of January 1960, we are going to enter into a life of contradictions. In politics, we have equality, and in social and economic life, we have inequality. How long shall we continue to deny equality in our social and economic lives? If we continue to deny it for long, we'll do so only by putting our political democracy in peril. We must remove this contradiction at the earliest possible moment else those who suffer from inequality will blow up the structure of democracy which this Constituent Assembly has so laboriously built up. Rosalind was keen that an enlightened social policy be evolved which would ultimately lead to social justice. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are very fortunate in having Professor Dipankar Gupta, who delivered the 22nd Rosalind Memorial Lecture and enlightened us on the subject. Professor Gupta is a distinguished professor and director of the Center of Political Affairs and Critical Theory, Shiv Nadar University. He was educated in Delhi School of Economics and JNU, from where he obtained his master's and doctoral degrees respectively. Over the years, he has held many visiting appointments in universities in North America, Europe, and the UK, namely Toronto University, Strasbourg University, and others. In 2007, he was Woodrow Wilson Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. He was the first Asian nominee to the Visiting Asia Chair in the Institute of Politics and Social Sciences, Paris, in 2004. Currently, Professor Gupta is a member of several boards like Reserve Bank of India, NABARD, National Standards Broadcasting University, Punjab Governance Reforms Commission, and Noon School. You must have paid quite full. He has published nearly 70 research papers and won several awards for his academic contribution. He has regular columns in 2 national dailies, including the Times of India. If I may just say in a lighter vein, there's an advocate called Dipankar Gupta in the Supreme Court, senior advocate. People will phone him, say, Dipankar, what do you mean by this? What do you? I haven't written anything. That Dipankar didn't have a clue about socio-economics. And he was very embarrassed. So he said, please tell him to write Professor Dipankar Gupta. Well, the other thing is, he has written or edited 18 books, including The Cage Phoenix, Can India Fly?, which was republished by Stanford University Press in 2009. His latest book is titled A Revolution from Above, India's Future and Citizen Elite. In 2010, the French government honored him as a Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres. Then Markavarich's Award for Distinguished Contributions to Development Studies in 2004. And Professor Gupta has to be heard. He has a pleasant voice. He has to be read. A copy of his lecture will be circulated later. And he has to be digested. That's important, and it will take some time for that. But Professor Gupta this evening will highlight what he considered in his lecture how damaging quantitative thresholds can be on the making of social policy. But I think I've spoken enough. So without further ado, Professor Dipankar Gupta, the floor is all yours.
Mr. Soli Sorabji, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. To speak in the memory of Rosalind Wilson is not an ordinary task, because she was indeed an extraordinary person. And from what I've heard from her friends and from Mr. Sorabji today, she brought joy to many hearts, and she found wonderful things in ordinary people. Well, some songs I think will never die, because there'll always be children. And Rosalind Wilson's dedication to children is something that we all pay tribute to. I'm rather happy, I think, on this occasion that Mr. Soli Sorabji helped me to warm up to my subject by quoting Ambedkar and also invoking the subject of social justice, both of which will figure in this presentation. The title of this lecture is a bit daunting. I know it is daunting even to me, but the theme is really quite simple. And I think Mr. Sorabji has spelled it out succinctly and accurately. What I'm really arguing is that public policies invariably fail when they use threshold markers to identify a target group. This is because these threshold markers divide citizens, and I'm really very serious about this. I don't think citizens should be divided as citizens. They add to corruption and bring down the overall levels of social well-being. I insist that social programs are best delivered when we think of society first and not of any one section in it. I shall try and demonstrate this thesis by taking first the various anti-poverty programs, then the Industrial Disputes Act, which includes workers and employers or managers, and finally the Mandal Commission and the OBC reservations. In all cases, I hope to show that the initiatives fail to deliver to the needy and underprivileged, primarily because they begin by segregating citizens on a quantitative basis. Threshold markers, incidentally, work best to indicate emergency conditions that must be righted at the earliest because they're emergency conditions. The danger mark of a swelling river, elevated body temperature, epidemic conditions, inflation rates, even the price of tomatoes, are numbers that signal danger. These figures prompt us to action so that a crisis can be averted and disaster kept at bay. The emphasis clearly is to take steps so that status quo ante, or the past normal state of affairs, can be restored and those dangerous signs do not pop up again. With threshold markers of this kind, administrative authorities have a bearing on what has to be corrected so that we can get back to our earlier comfort zones. Quick and effective action can combat flood conditions, high fever, epidemics, and inflation. Once the figures return to normal, authorities can then take their foot off the pedal and administration can go back to cruise control. As long as these threshold markers signify emergency conditions that are far from normal, it is useful to depend on them. When it is not a question of getting back to a past normal or status quo ante, but to transform the present normal, then these thresholds do more harm than good. This is especially true when a poor country with low educational and health standards seeks to better itself. While stress lines may be more prominent in one segment of the society, it is not as if this fault is locked in just there. This is why threshold figures that segregate citizens from one another end up being counterproductive. In other words, if it is not an emergency situation that calls for a return to status quo ante, it is best to resist threshold markers that isolate a population and cater to just that segment. Why should this be so? Where is the harm if we identify those below the poverty line and aim specific policies in that direction? Or devise labor laws which separate workers on the basis of the size of the organization they work for? Or to put a numerical formula in place that can score different degrees of social backwardness for purposes of reservation? On the face of it, separating a population that is most needy makes eminent sense. Surely, we should be able to sift out such people from the rest so that our interventions gain in cogency and focus. Appealing though this approach might seem at first sight, it really is not as effective as it looks. Policies that pull out one section of the population from the rest encourage inefficiency, corruption, and worse. When issues to be set right are transformative in nature, as in our country, and have society-wide applications, then we're not thinking of emergency measures at all. As we are now in for the long haul, and a new world is being sought after, threshold markers can very dangerously take our eyes off the ball. In circumstances such as these, it is necessary to take the whole society along and think in universal terms. Let us first examine programs meant only for the poor, where others who are not poor need not apply. The overwhelming fact of economic backwardness in India has generated many anti-poverty programs where the targeted group is docketed as the very poor, the so-called below poverty line families or BPL families. As most of us know, there has been a very rich debate on who actually constitute the poor. But the undeniable conclusion is that there are just too many who live in absolutely wretched conditions. The numbers vary from the official 27% who are below the poverty line to 50% and even 77% depending upon whose barometer we're looking at. But do we really need poverty statistics to tell us that India is very poor? Does it really help to know if Arjun Sen Gupta, the late Arjun Sen Gupta, has bested the late Tendulkar's or the Planning Commission's estimates and even that of NC Saxena? Regardless of this number controversy, the fact remains that between 10 to 15 crore families can barely feed themselves. Add to this the statistic that the total of stunted and undernourished children in India roughly equals the population of sub-Saharan Africa. We now really begin to get a sense of the monster, the size, the enormity of the monster we're looking at. With numbers as large as these, can we really think of a special program just for the poor? There are two sets of problems which accompany such state-targeted anti-poverty drives. First, these policies are usually hit by inefficiency and worse, and yet money is routinely poured into them till another one is devised that then divert the funds and divert our minds as well. The reason why they never quite work and attract the worst in bureaucracy is because privileged decision makers would never stoop to access these services for themselves. These are for other people, the poor, who live in a different world and have already been segregated by threshold markers. The world is their world, or that world is socially so far away that it is difficult to empathize with those who occupy it. Therefore, when a policy is of no use in real terms to the better off, why should they really bother as long as the form-filling exercises have been properly done? Sadly, those who are underprivileged do not have the connections and wherewithal to take matters in their own hands. Therefore, policies designed to help the poor are either ill-conceived or just allowed to rot. Take a few examples. A planning commission study notes that most often poor beneficiaries need to pay speed money that they can hardly afford to access the National Family Benefit Scheme designed specially for them. The Integrated Rural Development Program of the 70s failed to make entrepreneurs of poor farmers as banks were reluctant to give them loans. So the IRDP was replaced by the Swaran Jayanti Gram Rozgar Yojana in 1999, which studies suggest were almost entirely used by the non-poor. Likewise, when the Jawahar Rozgar Yojana in 1989 performed below par, it was relaunched as Jawahar Gram Samriddhi Yojana a decade later, but that flopped too. In fact, it generated fewer man-days of work than the program it replaced with such fanfare. The public distribution system, as we all know, is such a leaky bucket that at least 41% of its grain finds its way into the open market. Even Manrega has come in for a lot of criticism on account of its non-performance in states where it matters the most. According to the Commission for Agricultural Costs and Prices, the impact of Manrega in raising agricultural wages is really minimal, perhaps as low as 0.5%. Besides downright corruption and misuse, bad planning too takes its toll. An audit report of Jawahar Rozgar Yojana discovered that funds were utilized in the terminal quarter of a project, just so that the books could be dressed up. The second drawback of the for the official poor only approach arises as it artificially reduces numbers just to seem legitimate or even to save face. BPL markers, after all, actually succeed in separating the poor from the rest as a clearly identifiable minority. For example, the Rashtra Swasthya Bima Yojana, a national health insurance policy, is meant only for those who are officially below the poverty line. This automatically excludes the rest who do not have a BPL card, which, as you know, is not easy to get, and who may still be very poor and unable to afford medical expenses. Yet, as they officially not BPL, they cannot use this insurance scheme. Those slightly above the poverty line are still very, very poor. It's just a matter of a few rupees that separates them from BPL families. And as a consequence, they do not qualify to take advantage of these for the officially poor only programs. A better method of combating poverty would be to take on board, like a Noah's Ark, certain essential services which must be delivered to all so that we can together sail into a developed world. Instead of looking just at survival levels and BPL markers, it is better to think of the quality and scale of public goods like health and education. Both Tendulkar and Saxena encouraged this perspective, but they never quite got the attention they deserved. Consequently, projects meant for the poor often went to the wrong address. Education for the poor has had disastrous results. According to the Indian Human Development Survey, about half the children in middle school are unable to read and make sense of a simple paragraph or do an elementary sum. As these designed for the poor government schools fail to deliver, even to the poor, enrollments have gone up phenomenally in private schools. This is easily revealed by the fact that while in 1980s merely 2% of the country's children were in private schools, today the number has ballooned to about 21%. If we take just the urban children, then the figure is as high as 51%. Even amongst the lowest income quintile, and that is the very, very, very poor, as many as 15% of the children go to private schools. What do they have left to eat, I wonder? That is how badly education for the poor policies have fared. So many of them have died on the vine, and dropout rates, as a consequence, are very high. The story is similar for the health sector too. In fact, it's just the same story all over again. The poor distrust government hospitals just as they do state-run schools. That is why even the doctors in public hospitals are better trained than the near quacks in many private rural clinics, yet they do not have the trust of the poor. This explains why as many as 71% of the sick regularly go to private doctors even though they can hardly afford to do so. This is also why medical bills force so many people into chronic debt every year. Extensive surveys have shown that as many as 39 million people are pushed to poverty annually on account of ill health. India figures very high, almost at the top, when it comes to out-of-pocket expenses for health. This is hardly a pedestal worth occupying, but that is exactly where we are, because as much as 78% of medical costs in India are borne by the patient. To a significant extent, hospital costs boost health expenses. After examining the 60th round of National Sample Survey, Indrani Gupta concludes that among those who reported going to hospitals, treatment cost was about 6,332 for rural India and about 9,806 for urban India. An earlier Planning Commission report tells us that only 35% in India have access to essential drugs. Contrast this with the fact that in upper middle income countries, and not just the very rich, 82% are able to afford such drugs. It would be fair to conclude the poor can best be served if we pay attention to how society as a whole fares in terms of essential public goods. As thresholds keep certain facilities outside the general pool, their horrible standards escape notice. This also explains the ease with which these for the officially poor only programs can fudge funds, figures, and facts. As a result, targeted approaches attract corrupt officials and very little good actually happens on the ground. This is why it is important not to be solely attentive to how much money is being spent on public services. The emphasis should rather be on delivery. After all is said and done and money poured endlessly in a bottomless bucket, one overwhelming question keeps cropping up. Is it really helpful to have a quantitative threshold marker to take people out of poverty? Our Indian experience gives us a negative story of failed attempts, and all of that is naturally quite disheartening. But if the experience of many developed countries is anything to go by, then the universalization of health and education is the surest way out of poverty to prosperity. Textbook history will tell us that most European countries did not begin by being rich, but became wealthy because of the universalistic policies they adopted. Let us now move to a completely different terrain, that of labor laws, and view the damage that numerical thresholds can create here as well. To this end, it is convenient to examine the Industrial Disputes Act as it operates today. The relationship between entrepreneur and worker is fraught and tense to begin with, and our Industrial Disputes Act does its best to make it worse. The expressed desire to support small-scale industries led to the first set of thresholds that segregated small, medium, micro, and large enterprises. This exercise, incidentally, did no good either to those who ran fragile cottage industries or to those who owned and worked in bigger units. What happened instead was that this threshold helped to host a large number of malpractices. Fairly large enterprises began adjusting their operations by breaking up the organization into smaller units in order to qualify as small scale and draw benefits on that score. Among the benefits are, as you know, tax concessions, export support, and what is more, freedom from observing normal accounting standards. In fact, beedi making contrived to refashion itself, beedi making, as a cottage industry that in order to beat the regulations that apply to the organized sector. It was not in the cottage sector earlier, but it moved there just to beat those regulations. The Industrial Dispute Act recommends a works committee with its embedded reconciliation mechanism only if an establishment has 100 or more workers who are on the rolls for at least a year. Right away, the scope for fudging starts. If less than 100 and if workers are not around for a year at a stretch, then the obligation to set up such a committee is off. Further, if a person is employed for less than a year, calculated as 240 days of continuous employment, then in the event of a layoff, that worker can be dismissed without adequate compensation. The trick then lies to somehow make sure that no employee is kept on the rolls for more than 240 days, as this makes laying them off so fuss-free and cost-saving. Things heat up once we come to Chapter 5 of this Act, which is about layoffs, retrenchment, and closure, but only in certain establishments. Now, which establishments could these be? If an enterprise has 100 or more workers who have been employed on an average per working day for the preceding 12 months, then and only then will certain rules apply. Stay below this threshold, and you are spared of a whole host of regulations. At 99 employees who average at less than 1 year of employment, the special provisions relating to layoffs, retrenchment, etc. do not kick in. Cross the threshold and it's now necessary to get government permission to lay off anybody. Approaching the administration for permission to cast off workers is a pain that no entrepreneur would like to entertain. The remedy then is to keep the unit strength to below 100 workers and preferably turn them around before 240 days are up, as before they are officially employed for 1 year. Put all these numbers together and shake them up, and what do you get? Answer: an aversion for large-scale units on the side of the entrepreneur and a low accumulation of skills on the side of the worker. If I'm going to be turned over every 240 days, there's no reason why I should pay attention to skill gathering. Obviously, all these thresholds harm both parties, and yet we go on because we are slaves of habit. One hears a lot from industrial houses and from organizations like CII and FICCI about how damaging this act is because of its threshold-linked obligations. It is these, they contend, that keep them from hiring and dismissing workers and right-sizing their companies. Unfortunately, there are not as many complaints from the side of the workers. This is largely because the unionized employees whose wheels squeak the loudest are on top of the heap and are completely protected. Therefore, established trade unions have no reason to raise this issue, and this leaves those in the unorganized sector and informal sector completely unprotected. and to a large extent, by the way, unskilled as well. Take a look at what Chapter 7 has to say in Section 4. Quote, "In every establishment, the number of workmen to be recognized as protected workmen for the purpose of subsection 3 shall be 1% of the total number of workmen employed therein." Hard to believe, but it's true. Some workmen are to be protected, others not. Naturally, labor aristocracy is rampant in trade unions, which is why trade unions, such as they are, find little fault with IDA and rarely voice threshold-based complaints. That the bulk of workers in the informal sector remain vulnerable is no concern of theirs. It is hardly surprising then that the numbers of informal and unorganized workers has grown significantly over the years. Arjun Sengupta had shown that between 1999 and 2004, the contribution of informal laborers to the formal sector rose from 37.8% to 46.6%, over 7% in about 5 years. Using another scale of measurement, Sood, Nath, and Ghosh demonstrate the share of contract worker in organized employment has more than doubled between 2003-04 and 2009-10, 6 years roughly. The Indian Labour Employment Report also points out that average daily earnings of a casual worker in 2011 was 138 in rural areas and 173 in urban areas. But when it comes to regular workers, it is rupees 298 in rural areas, almost double, and rupees 445 in urban areas, almost triple. As minimum labor norms and standards are really rock bottom, they help ensnare the industrial economy in a syndrome of low wage productivity. No marks for guessing why in India we've chosen this low road to growth, which exploits cheap labor, and not the high road to growth that pushes up innovation and technology. What have we then accomplished with our threshold markers in the context of labor relations? We have succeeded in obfuscating records, undermining labor standards, and lowering human resource skill and dividing the workers. Yet thresholds have a magical hold on all those who concern themselves with industrial disputes. The most they can think of, as in the case of Rajasthan, is of raising or lowering some threshold or the other. If, however, and this is something I'd like you to pay attention to, there were no thresholds at all, then every worker would be on the muster, they would without exception be entitled to benefits, and there would be a set procedure for dismissal and layoffs that would apply to all. To make the last point effective, it is necessary to insist that to retrench a worker or to take a worker off the payroll, the compensation provided would be the same regardless of the number of days employed or the size of the firm. This would immediately put an end to idiosyncratic management behavior and make both labor and entrepreneur more responsible to each other and also to the organization to which they belong. Now, this is the last illustration, and I want to show how damaging thresholds can be in the making of social policy. And I'm taking up the case of reservation, which is probably more contentious than the issue of industrial labor. We are now going to discuss the question of reservations for other backward classes or OBC. Well, by the way, right away I must tell you that the letter C in OBC doesn't refer to caste, but to class. It's actually other backward classes. But because there's a huge amount of disinformation, misinformation, most of us think the C in OBC is actually about caste. It is hardly necessary to recall that Kaka Kalelkar, who was first commissioned to look into the issue of OBCs in 1955, gave up because he found the task impossible to accomplish. Yet, in 1979, when Mandal came out with his report on identifying OBCs, he seemed to have little problems in coming up with a criteria set. When the government accepted these recommendations in the 1990s, the flaws in arriving at who qualifies to be backward according to a quantitative score became all too clear. If one were to look closely at the criteria for social backwardness, it would become quite apparent that the considerations that went into the reckoning of who were OBCs were politically weighted. Before we start disassembling this ingenious scheme, let us remember that the Mandal Commission listed 3 categories of backwardness, 3 categories: social, economic, and educational. Further, though the maximum points a category of the population could score is 22, it needed only 11 points to qualify as backward. Now please keep that in mind, only 11 points you need to qualify as backward. Then a sleight of hand happens. Social backwardness is privileged over other categories like educational backwardness and economic backwardness, because this is one area where the indicators can be flabby and easy to manipulate. This is probably why the 4 indicators of social backwardness, that category alone, carry 3 points each, which is higher or the highest among all the criteria in all 3 categories, that is social, economic, and educational. The criteria and education carry only 2 points each, and for economic backwardness, which is probably the most important diacritic, just 1 point. This itself should have sounded alarm bells, but obviously they didn't ring loud enough. Now take note of how easy it is to score these points simply because of the imprecision that characterizes these 4 indicators. The first indicator is whether the community caste in question performs manual labor. The second is what other castes think of this particular caste. The third, do the women in the caste work outside the home? And finally, whether 25% of females and 10% of males get married before the legal age of marriage. In this case, pay attention to the fact that points are actually being given for breaking the law, a law that was framed to combat child marriages and give women dignity. The structure of allotting points is almost tailor-made as well for well-to-do castes to make it as backwards. With 3 marks for each criterion, it is so easy to score 12, and it just takes 11 to make the backward grade. As points for social backwardness have so much heft, educational economic backwardness, which should have been more important, need not come into the picture at all. Most land-owning peasants are proud to call themselves hands-on farmers. Manual workers, yes, we are hands-on farmers, whether or not they actually perform manual work. The urbanized rich Jats, as well as the equally prosperous Marathas, have often claimed the identity as working peasants. And I've heard this myself on a number of occasions, though they may be prosperous lawyers, doctors, and entrepreneurs in real life. The second criterion of women working outside their homes is not a good indicator either, as they need not necessarily be toiling on others' fields as coolie labor. Third, what do other castes think of your caste? Third, as we all know, no caste thinks well of any other caste anyway. So 3 points are in the bag even before we start. We have already commented upon the dubious criterion of age at marriage. In this connection, it also needs to be said that in India, marriages are rarely ever registered. It is so easy then to claim that one was married before the legal age, for there is no definitive way of ascertaining its veracity in most cases. Therefore, it is not unreasonable to argue, as critics of Mandal have, and many of them were sociologists, and one of the leaders in this field is Professor Andre Bete, who's sitting here, the provisions for OBC reservations were devised keeping political considerations in mind. Indeed, this also demonstrates the salience of peasant castes in contemporary Indian politics. If social backwardness alone can give a community 12 points, the sections of economic and educational backwardness feature only as background props. They lend the recommendation a certain legitimacy, but play a marginal role, if any at all. A politically dominant community can well and truly establish itself as OBC by relying on the nebulous markers of social backwardness. That is not all, as this form of quantification to qualify as backward was never quite challenged. OBC activists had the tail up and have now begun to enlarge the demands, claiming sometimes 65%, sometimes 70% reservations in keeping with their supposed numbers. We now have a scenario where almost the whole society claims to be deprived and demands special privileges. This is not only internally disarticulates targeted policies, it also perpetuates identity consciousness in a democracy. Baba Sahib Ambedkar had said that the majority must recognize the rights of the minority, but here we have a situation where the majority is demanding the rights of a minority. Now, how ironical is that? What is worse, unlike the formulation for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, there is no concession here to making OBC reservations time-bound. This feature is important to retain as the Ambedkar-led SC/ST reservations accepted in principle that this measure be limited to 10 years. That this has been repeatedly extended only undermines the principle behind why a time limit was placed. The 10-year review period was inserted in the ST/ST reservations format because these measures were supposed to be temporary in nature, just as you take measures to combat emergency conditions. They're temporary in nature. The violations of basic human dignity of SCs and STs were likened to a fever, an illness, and egregious growth on the body of a democratic state. Reservations were therefore considered as a sort of emergency measure so that normalcy of the kind that any democracy ought to experience can be established. Citizenship cannot do well if populations are divided by thresholds in order to implement this or that policy. Programs targeted for the poor face problems simply because those who are BPL are not seen as part of the general society. Instead of universal health and education, what the lowest economic class receives is poor health and poor education. Citizenship is also threatened when threshold markers separate the workforce. We found that the Industrial Disputes Act not only held back entrepreneurship, but also encouraged distrust between workers and managers. In order to evade a certain provision, attempts were constantly afoot to dodge the threshold marker by employing less than 100 and or by keeping a person on the job for less than a year. Ask yourself, under these conditions, how can skills grow? And how can our industrial sector function in a highly competitive world economy? Finally, citizenship is again flouted when reservations are put in place with threshold markers as justification. In this connection, one needs to take a particularly hard look at the Mandal recommendations, but alongside with it, remember the original intentions behind the laudable measures for SC/ST reservations, and these intentions are being subverted. Thank you for your patience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gupta, for not thought-provoking but thought-stimulating lecture. And I request Dr. Jyoti Bose to give a vote of thanks. It will go very well when it's given out. It reads well.
On behalf of us all, I'd like to thank Professor Dipankar Gupta for giving his lecture on the occasion of the 22nd Rosalind Wilson Memorial. I'd like to thank him for bringing our attention to some basics, really, something that we all go through every day, reading statistics, reading data, constant quantitative analysis, and then revealing to us how it actually seeks to divide society. I think we were also perhaps more startled. There are children here from Springdale School, and when we talk of private education for privileged children, we forget in a large measure what social policy and universalization should have done for education. Similarly, statistics reveal that we cannot just look at specific groups. That's true. I mean, today we heard that tomatoes were 80 rupees a kilo. Well, what goes on behind the scenes, we have to start looking at society as a larger whole, much above, perhaps, individual groups targeted through threshold markers. As a sociologist, I must admit, and many of our students sitting here, and of course Professor Bete, we found the lecture extremely stimulating and surely something very dear to Rosalind's heart, democracy and citizenship. And surely they cannot survive if we keep on at threshold markers, dividing our society instead of universalizing health, education, labor laws, and thinking of the larger whole. I'd like to thank all present here and, of course, Professor Dipankar Gupta. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you who spared your time and came to the lecture. And I hope to see all of you next July, 20th of July, for the next lecture. Thank you very much.